Hello and welcome to another TLDR UK video. In the past few years, it's become abundantly clear that the Labour Party are in a, pretty terrible situation. In the 2019 general election, they won the least number of seats in 85 years. Additionally, if the next election is in 2024, then the only Labour leader in 50 years to have won an election will be Tony Blair. This sums up just how dire the situation Labour is in. So it's probably worth explaining some avenues to number 10 that Labour could go down, discussing whether an electoral pact could actually be the best route forward to consolidate the left. If you want to support the content we make, then you can back us on Patreon. Doing so not only supports us as an independent, impartial news agency, but it also gets you perks like exclusive live events, discounts, the ability to vote on videos, and access to our official office tour. Find out what you can get and sign up by clicking the link in the description. One potential solution for Labour's woes is an electoral pact. While the exact nature of this can differ from pact to pact, effectively it means that a group of smaller parties will agree not to stand against each other. While this isn't common among major parties in the UK, it's not exactly unheard of either. Back in the 1980s, a bunch of disgruntled Labour MPs broke away and formed the Social Democrat Party. They then formed an electoral pact with the Liberal Democrats, and in the subsequent election, they actually merged with them. In fact, as we discussed in a full video on the topic, the Cooperative Party has had an electoral pact with Labour for decades. What's being proposed here, though, is much bigger, and if it actually happens, much more historically significant than either of these previous examples. Specifically, the proposed pact would see Labour form an electoral alliance, with the construction of a new governing coalition between Labour, the Liberal Democrats, and the politically homeless. As this is such a huge idea, it's probably worth mentioning exactly who proposed it. And that was Tony Blair. That's right, the only living elected Labour Prime Minister. So, is he onto something? After all, if there's one person who knows how the left can win elections, surely it's him. We'll assume for this video that an electoral pact means that only one left-wing party will stand in each constituency. This will be determined by whichever had the most votes prior to the pact. In order to see what effect this would have, we looked at data from the 2019 general election. We then calculated how many seats each of the left-wing parties could have won if the other left-wing parties didn't stand, and their voters voted for them instead. For example, if the Liberal Democrats came second to the Conservatives, then we added all of the Labour, Green, etc. votes to their vote total, we'll see whether they could have beaten the Tories. We found out that in total, the left-wing coalition would have won a huge 65 additional seats. Most of these would have gone to Labour, but 17 would have gone to Liberal Democrats and 5 to the SNP. This would leave the electoral pact with 26 more seats than the opposition, made up of the Conservatives and DUP, with the electoral pact on 334 seats and the Conservatives on 300. When looking at the data, our alternative 2019 election, where an electoral pact was formed, saw many of the seats that were won by the Conservatives in the actual election remain with Labour. Of Labour's 43 additional seats won as a result of this hypothetical pact, 28 of them were Labour seats prior to the election, the ones that they lost to the Tories in the real thing. Perhaps then, the perceived swing in the 2019 election wasn't as large as we thought. Perhaps it was just large enough to overcome the fragmented left, but not enough to overcome a united left. So we've established that it's possible Labour stands a real chance of winning if it were to band together with other left-of-centre parties. But what other advantages are there? Well, if you support a smaller party, the obvious advantage is power. While the Liberal Democrats were in a governing coalition between 2010 and 2015, it's not looking likely that this will happen again anytime soon. When they entered into the coalition, they had 57 seats, and 5 years later, that dropped to only 8. While they did win 11 seats in 2019, a slight increase from the previous years, it doesn't look like they'll be returning to 2010 numbers anytime soon. The point we're making is that if you're a Liberal Democrat supporter and want to see the Liberal Democrats back in power, then an electoral pact may be the only genuine possibility. So the main advantage to the left is that an electoral pact could lead to power for both Labour and the smaller parties. There are, though, some disadvantages. Firstly, some would argue that it isn't necessary for Labour to form an electoral pact. Yes, they've lost the last 4 elections, but it isn't uncommon in British politics for the opposition parties to be out of power for a number of years. With the right campaign and the right policies, there's nothing stopping Labour from outright winning the next election. And if they can do that, then they don't have to share power and compromise on their manifesto with other smaller parties. Secondly, Britain just isn't used to coalition governments, and there were some serious hurdles to the 2010-2015 coalition, and that was just between 2 parties. This one would entail a number of left-wing parties, and negotiating every policy would be hard, and disagreements would be common. Thirdly, while it's one thing forming a coalition after an election, it's a whole different thing trying to form an electoral pact before one. Forming a pact means that irrespective of how well you do, you're wedded to governing with your pact partners. And for parties with distinct policies, this might be enough to put them off agreeing to it. After all, the Greens want, understandably, more of a focus on environmental issues than other policies. The Liberal Democrats have a focus on electoral reform, and this is true across all smaller parties. Meaning the only thing the coalition would really have in common is their anti-Tory sentiment. And for most voters, that wouldn't be enough. Sure, some younger, more left-wing voters may find this appealing, but older floating voters likely wouldn't. The fourth downside for Labour is that they'd likely be held responsible for the policies of the smaller parties. And this could include the SNP's policies on leaving the UK, something that English voters wouldn't be all that enthused about. In fact, back in 2015, the Conservatives used a campaign poster depicting Ed Miliband in Alex Salmond's pocket. This was designed to stoke up fear of an SNP-Labour coalition. If the Tories were able to use this potential coalition to their advantage, imagine what they'd do if an electoral pact were officially announced. These then are the main downsides to such a pact. But we ought to look at whether this plan would actually work, and whether we're right to say that they could win with a narrow 26-seat lead. That's because the Pact's electoral viability rests on the assumption that voters do as they're told. And we know this is untrue. Voters do not like being told what to do, and they don't like being taken for granted. In the recent West of England mayoral races, of the 96,000 Lib Dem and Green voters, only around 41,000 reallocated their second preference to Labour. In fact, about 12,000 went on to the Conservatives, suggesting that a left-wing alliance might not be as strong as we thought, with people not necessarily tracking along ideological lines between parties. As another example, look at the 2017 snap election. Theresa May was ahead in the polls, and so she decided to hold a general election, but went on to reduce her majority. It could be argued that her presumption that voters would do as they're expected contributed to this mess of an election. Therefore, to assume that all left-wing voters will simply get behind the most popular left-wing party in their area is a monumental oversimplification. It seems then that the potential damage that Labour could suffer from agreeing to an electoral pact could be bigger than the best case scenario of gaining other left-wing voters. But what do you think? Do you believe that an electoral pact would be advantageous to the left? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.